to start this workshop. Officially. I'm Ergi, and I'm YE project lead for the nuclear energy getting to the core project, being implemented by Youth and Environment Europe with the support and in close cooperation with Heinrich-Böll-Stiftung European Union. This is a short-term project aiming to empower young people to understand and tackle energy issues, and I'll be the moderator of this workshop. Before starting the workshop, I would like to invite you for a small warm-up activity to test your information on nuclear waste management and nuclear waste in general through a short poll, and feel free to choose the option that looks correct to you. Now we are launching the first question. Just a second. Eva, is the poll ready? Great. Yeah, and the first question is being launched now. Great. The most hazardous, with more than 90% radioactivity in nuclear waste, is in the form of spent fuel from reprocessing. Reprocessing of spent nuclear fuel poses increased challenges, including proliferation risk, high exposures to humans, and contamination of the environment. And now let's jump to the second question, to the second poll. Yeah, and the correct answer, according to the World Nuclear Waste Report, is that over 60,000 tons of spent nuclear fuel are stored across Europe, excluding Russia and Slovakia, most of which are stored in France. And now we are launching the third question. And the third question is out. Feel free to choose the correct option. Yeah, and with a share of 30%, France will be Europe's greatest producer of nuclear waste, followed by the UK, 20%, the Ukraine, 80%, and Germany, 8%. These four countries account for more than 75% of the European nuclear waste. And thank you for your contribution. And now let's get back to the agenda. This is the second workshop that we are organizing in the frame of this project. The first one took place at the end of October, and it was focused on the state of nuclear energy in Europe. The workshop that we are organizing today is focused on the issue of nuclear waste management and the intergenerational aspect. Achieving intergenerational equity is one of the cornerstones of nuclear waste management, but given the highly technical and scientific level of the debate and the lack of access for young people to nuclear issues, this still remains vague. We will dive into these issues through a workshop agenda structured to provide viewpoints and insights on the issue of nuclear waste and intergenerational aspect from the angles of decision-making, technical and youth lens. Briefly, I will introduce the agenda, which is divided in two parts. In the first part of the agenda, we are going to have a panel of discussion on the nuclear waste management and intergenerational aspect with three outstanding panelists, while in the second part, an interactive session will take place where the participants will interact and share with each other their viewpoints on the issue of nuclear waste management and their perception as well. Before getting to the substance of this meeting, let me introduce the organizers of this workshop. Youth and Environment Europe is the largest independent European network of environmental youth organizations, and our goal is to mitigate the climate crisis by raising awareness and building capacity among youth on the climate crisis, enhancing international cooperation and knowledge sharing among our members, and strengthening the participation of youth in environmental and climate decision-making processes. And Heinrich-Böll-Stiftung European Union represents the foundation vis-a-vis European and international institution, associations, non-governmental organizations and media based in Brussels. The office is a main point of contact for individuals, groups, and organizations from around the world interested in new politics and policies. The Heinrich-Böll Foundation has worked in shedding light on the different perception and myth of nuclear energy. And I would like now to invite Martin Keim, Head of European Energy Transition Program on Heinrich-Böll Foundation, to enlighten more us on the work of Heinrich-Böll Foundation European Union on nuclear energy. Martin, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Ergi. Thank you, and a very warm welcome also from Heinrich-Böll Foundation here from the Brussels office. As Ergi said, my name is Martin Keim, and I'm very happy to be here this morning and to host or co-host the second edition of our workshop series. I will keep it short and sweet to just give you a couple of indications or links to what Heinrich-Böll Foundation has done on nuclear energy and the problematic sides of it. So as you might know, Heinrich-Böll Foundation is closely linked to the Green German Party, which interestingly now is part of the new government, and I'm certain about this. We will also dive in about how Germany's future regarding nuclear energy will look like, more specifically next year with a phase out that is scheduled already. So that we'll have plenty of opportunities to talk about this topic in depth later. But just to give you a bit of an overview, the Heinrich-Böll Foundation's Brussels office has published a dossier, an online dossier, to link to the anniversary of the sad anniversary of 35 years of Chernobyl this year. As you know, the Chernobyl accident happened in 1986, and so you can find this dossier on our website. I'll post the link in a second. It is basically a comprehensive dossier with interviews, links to analysis, different reports. And of course, as we today look more focusedly on the issue of waste, nuclear waste, the risk of it, and why it's so difficult to deal with it, I wanted to draw your attention to one report in particular, which is another report that the Heinrich-Böll Foundation supported and co-organized, and we're very proud of that flagship report. It's called the World Nuclear Waste Report. You can now also find the link in the chat. The World Nuclear Waste Report is basically detailing the situation how in Europe and how different countries are actually dealing with the issue of nuclear waste, how uranium mining is dealt with in national legislation, and how how the different countries face the situation. Last but not least, I'll also post another link to something that's more of an overall topic at the moment. You all realize that we as you are following the discussions around the climate crisis and how to mitigate that best, nuclear has resurged as an energy technology that some of the hardcore industrial lobbyists would basically propagate for as the solution to basically have a low carbon solution for the energy crisis. The South Africa office of the Heinrich-Böll Foundation recently published this report that I now put into the chat as well, which is basically looking more closely on the numbers on why nuclear energy could or could not be a solution for the climate crisis. Spoiler alert, as you see in the title of the publication, the result is that nuclear energy, for various economic but also risk reasons, is not actually a solution, neither for climate nor does it provide enough jobs compared to other energy technologies such as renewable energies. Without further ado, I mentioned I would keep it short and sweet. I will thank Youth Environment Europe for organizing this workshop. Thank you very much, Ergi, also for taking on the role of the moderator, and the floor is yours now.
Thank you, Martin. Yeah, now let's get to the content. As I said, just at the very beginning of this meeting, the panel of discussion is shared with 3 outstanding panelists. The first one is Jutta Paulus, the member of European Parliament for the Greens, the European Free Alliance since 2019. She is a member of the committees on environment, public health and food safety, industry, research and energy, and transport. She is the reporter for the revision of the EU regulation for monitoring, reporting and verification of shipping emissions. Jutta Paulus dedicated her political work to climate, energy, and environmental challenges, and she aims to achieve that the European Union takes effective action against climate change and that human beings, animals, and nature are protected from destruction, pollution, and poisoning. While the second speaker is Esther Matias, graduated from political science at Central European University at ELTE University, where she was mainly researching the field of environmental politics. She is a PhD candidate in environmental science at Central European University and writing her PhD research on nuclear energy legitimacy. Although she is a member of Nuclear Transparency Watch and the Civil Society Program for EU-RED. And the third speaker is Laura. Laura is the YE project lead on environmental law. In her work in YE, she seeks to raise awareness about international and EU environmental law as a way to strengthen political advocacy and to empower young people to make use of legal tools to ensure the better implementation of existing problems relating to climate and environment. Laura studied law in the UK, the Netherlands, and Germany, and focused on international environmental law in her master's. Now, let's start with a panel of discussion. Now, I would like to give the floor to Mrs. Jutta Paulus to enlighten us more on the importance of intergenerational dialogue on nuclear waste management and energy policies in general, how this could be improved, and what young people and decision makers can do to ensure that the viewpoints of upcoming generations are incorporated in such important issues. Now, I will pass the floor to Jutta.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for organizing this workshop and also for inviting me and giving me the floor. As I've seen that this workshop is rather international, and I think that a lot of people may not know about the, let's call it, the history of nuclear energy in Germany. I would like to briefly dwell on this. Germany had a nuclear minister in the 50s because nuclear was, well, seen as the energy source for the future, and everyone was very enthusiastic about this new energy. And actually what even back then was quite remarkable, in my view, that the energy companies did not want to take on this technology. It was politics that pushed them to do so. And politics also funneled millions and billions of money in this technology, doing research, supporting the build of pilot projects, and also taking over all liability for anything that might occur from these reactors, because that was the only way that the industry would actually take on this technology, because they said, well, we have until now not needed this technology, and we would like to stick to our fossil fuel technology. No one was speaking of climate change back then, naturally. And in the 60s, the first reactors were being constructed, and in the 70s, there was a huge program to build dozens of nuclear reactors in Germany. But then something very remarkable happened. There was a very strong movement against nuclear energy, and it was not only the Greens, the environmentalists, but also very ordinary people who said, well, we are quite skeptical about this technology and we do not want to take it on in our country. So there were very large protests where, as I said, normal people took part, and there was a lot of police violence, which also, well, gave people second thoughts about this technology in the first place. After all, there were nuclear plants, power plants being built in Germany, ostensibly, we still have them, but the huge program that was originally envisaged was not built at the end of the day. So we ended up with some 20 plus plants in Germany, but the huge program was not brought to life. Even back then, everyone knew that there would have to be a repository for spent nuclear waste. In the early days, it was still planned to use own facilities to separate the highly radioactive nuclear waste from less radioactive nuclear waste. This was also a project that was accompanied by large protests from people, and at the end of the day, it was abandoned, so that every ton of nuclear waste in Germany was sent to France at the end of the day in order to do the separation, and we've received back the highly radioactive waste. Then there was the question where to store it, and the government in the 70s chose Gorleben, which is a place which was close to the German border when we still had the Cold War. There was the wall through Berlin, and also the highly protected border with lots of people who actually died there trying to get over the border. And the place which was chosen to store the nuclear waste was very close to that border. It was a sparsely populated area, and it was not really geologically ideal, but it was thought by the former government that it would be possible to store the waste there because there would be less protest. Well, that was wrong. There was a lot of protest, a lot of trains transporting the nuclear waste were blocked on their way to that to Gorleben, and it was a hotspot of societal resistance against this storage. And we now have, which was agreed upon, I think 5 years ago, we now have a nuclear waste law which says we are not inclined to use Gorleben. So we start again with, let's call it a white map, and we are looking in a participatory process where to best store the nuclear waste, which is, I think, quite remarkable. No one would have thought it back then, so to speak. But this process is now ongoing, and it will probably take another 10 years until the place where the actual waste can be stored will be chosen. And then it will take another 20 years until this place can be used. So what we are seeing now, often it is said, well, now that we have agreed on the nuclear phase out, we have the problem with the waste. Well, actually, we have the problem with the waste ever since we agreed to use nuclear energy in the first place. So the problem with the waste is not a problem of Germany, but it's a problem of every country that uses nuclear energy. And now that we're talking at the European level about a green taxonomy of finance products, we have member states in Europe that are using nuclear energy and that are pushing very strongly to include nuclear energy as a green activity, because it does not emit, or does emit CO2, but only very, very few emissions as compared to fossil fuels. And therefore, those member states, they say, we want to funnel additional state funds and also private money into these products, into finance products containing nuclear energy, because else we will not be able to enlarge the nuclear production in order to reduce our CO2 emissions. This has been a very highly debated issue at European level, and there have been several studies being done trying to find out, is the use of nuclear energy a sustainable activity, and does it do significant harm in the long term? Interestingly, the Joint Research Council from the European Union concluded that it does not do significant harm, but what their main error, in my view, is that they said, well, there are already concepts of how to store nuclear waste, and therefore it's not a problem. Well, coming from science myself, I would say a concept is not a proof. A concept is a concept, and it has yet to be proven. We have one single place in Europe where it is probable that in the coming years there will be a depository for nuclear waste, and this is of course in Finland. They're using a very deep mine in granite. I don't know whether it's the correct English word, in stone, so to speak. They're going 3,000 meters deep using copper vessels to store the nuclear waste, and they're deeming it safe, and also the population has agreed to it, and they're quite happy having this storage facility, because they say, well, it's jobs for our town. But I don't think that we should take one single example which has not started operation yet as proof that it is possible to store nuclear waste safely for at least 500,000 years, because that's the time that we need to know that the radioactivity has gone down accordingly, so that the storage is safe. And secondly, I think what few people have raised comments about is, you don't only need the geological facility, you also need people that actually know what's being stored there and how to handle this. And that's something that, well, it might be quite challenging finding someone who in, let's say, 20,000 years knows what radioactivity might be and what dangers might come from this technology. So that's an issue that is debated among scientists, but it has not found its way out to the public debate. So my personal view has been, for a very long time, we have opened the Pandora's box of using nuclear energy, leaving this legacy to our successors. And it's now our duty to do the utmost to make sure that this is stored securely and safely, and that all information is passed on in a way that cannot be, or that rather in a way that is uniquely accessible, because a paper will not be there in 1,000 years. Stone might be there in 1,000 years. But what symbols are we going to use to show to people how dangerous this waste may be? Because if you imagine you're an archaeologist, you're finding a cave where there are copper vessels. Oh, wow, that's fascinating. How can we make clear to those people that those should not be opened? It's not a good idea. So which symbols are we going to use? Which safeguards can we take? It's much too late to say we shouldn't have opened this box in the first place, because it has been done worldwide, but I think it would be a good idea to have a global discussion on how to store the waste, how to make sure that it doesn't seep into drinking water or into soil, how to make sure to pass on the knowledge, and last but not least, how to make sure that we do not produce ever more waste by further running nuclear facilities. I would stop here because we're supposed to debate, I believe. Thank you.
Thank you, Jutta. Thank you also for introducing us to the overview of Germany's nuclear energy journey. And this is very important to get the lessons learned of the past in order to ensure that they are not replicated in the following years. Now, I will pass the floor to Mrs. Esther Matias, who will get us through the Hungarian case and the role of young people to ensure transparency when it comes to nuclear energy issues, especially nuclear waste management. Esther, the floor is yours.
One second, I forgot to unmute myself, sorry. Thank you, Jutta, for this very interesting presentation. I was keen to learn about the German example since I'm going to present the Hungarian case, and it's, I don't know how many of you know, but it's the total opposite situation that you have in Germany. And that's basically one of the reasons why I wanted to talk about this issue today, because I think it really gives a great example of how to, you know, deal with radioactive waste issues in, you know, keeping in mind about the future generations. Just a quick introduction of me and today's agenda, even though Ergi introduced us pretty well, but I wanted to raise the attention to these two great NGOs or organizations, Nuclear Transparency Watch, which I'm a member of, and the EU's radioactive waste program that is dealing with radioactive waste issues. Even though I'm doing my PhD in environmental sciences, I have a political science background, so I quickly wanted to talk about the political issues also when it comes to radioactive waste issues. Ever since I started doing my research and working with nuclear energy and radioactive waste issues, I always had this question in my mind that Jutta also already discussed, that when politicians talk about nuclear energy, people who are pro-nuclear, they always highlight that it's a clean energy, right? Even nowadays, when it comes to climate change issues, there are several governments who raise this issue, and they say that we should expand the nuclear power plants. We should build more because that's going to be the solution for CO2 emission reduction. But as you can see, there's the quote from the IPCC special report. It actually says that the time of nuclear energy is over and we should invest more in renewable energies. But on the other hand, when you see a quote from a Hungarian Minister of Innovation and Energy, he says that it's super important to invest more in nuclear energy because that is the clean energy source, and we can only fight climate change when we have more nuclear power plants. So actually the situation now in Hungary is that we have 4 nuclear reactors, but the plan is to expand with 2 more reactors. So that's what we're in now. But what is important to know about nuclear energy is that even though we already discussed that it's a very technological issue, and you know, societies or politicians shouldn't really get involved in a sense that it's, you know, at the end it's a technological question. But in fact, what is the real situation is that it is a highly politicized issue. So politicians, governments, regimes use nuclear energy as basically, you know, sculpt societies. So this is how nuclear energy can be imagined when it comes to politics. And as you can see, the different type of political regimes use nuclear energy legitimacy issues differently. So while authoritarian regimes use education-oriented legitimacy instrument designs to gain more nuclear energy trust, from the democratic theory point of view, they think that the overall public doesn't really need to gain enough knowledge to create individual judgments. So what they basically say is that, we have all the information, all the resources, we can decide whether we want to have nuclear power plants or not. But what is interesting, when it comes to the public opinion is that I just provided 2 public polls that I found online, and I think it's a really good example. You can just tell if you read the questions, which question was raised by Greenpeace and which one was raised by the state-owned electricity company. As you can see, even just when it comes to asking our opinions, it is manipulated. So, it's not only the case with nuclear energy, all other public polls are created the same. When a company or an NGO wants to know your opinion, they don't really want to know your opinion, right? They just want to strengthen their insights and ideology. But as you can see, the Hungarian society is very divided when it comes to nuclear energy. And they, the companies and the NGOs include other political issues into this, even into these questions. So when it comes to expanding POX nuclear power plant, there comes the other issues like the Russian influence and like the clean energy discussion. So it's not easy to find your way out in this, in this situation, even when it's just a question that they're raising for you. But there are, very high risks of nuclear energy when it comes to radioactive waste management issues. Jutta already talked about the problems for finding the final solution for spent fuel and the issues about the deep geological repositories. So I'm not going to discuss this in details. But there are, other risks that arise when it comes to radioactive waste management issues. Of course, it is highly problematic when it comes to environment and human health. And also, as you can see, the lack of comprehensive information on the risks that are associated with nuclear radioactive waste is huge, not just in Hungary, but in other countries too. But when it comes to Hungary, this is my all-time favorite picture, and I wanted to share with you because I think it raises the attention on the problem so clearly and so easily that is just amazing. This picture is from an official documentation of Püspökszilágy radioactive waste disposal. This is the only near-surface nuclear waste repository in Hungary, and it's for small and medium level radioactive waste. It was supposed to be only for institutional radioactive waste. It was started to operate in the 1970s, but during a short term, when POX nuclear power plant didn't have an official radioactive waste disposal, the nuclear waste from POX was also stored here. And as you can see, back in the day, there was no actual, good technology or documentation, as Jutta mentioned. They didn't label waste back in the day, not because, not out of stupidity or, lack of interest, but they didn't have the information on how to store radioactive waste. So what they thought was that it's a good idea to just store the waste in nylon bags and then put into this near surface nuclear waste repository. So as you can see, when we talk about future generations, we are already the future generations that have to, face all the risks that were raised by radioactive waste issues. And it's, that not just the transparency issue, it raises the transparency issues and the problems with repackaging. But in the case of Hungary, it also raises a very important question of corruption, because now, of course, there was a tritium leaking because of these baggages that got into the groundwater of this town. So there had to be a safety program that repackaged all of these packages. But the family who's doing it now, family company, or I don't know how you call that, but Hungarian political situation is very interesting nowadays. So the big investments are usually made by a family of a famous Hungarian oligarch. And you know, it also raises another question that if we think about the short terms as politicians usually think about, then how can a company that has no experience in managing radioactive waste build a new, you know, repository, and like how can they repackage all of these systems? And you know, Hungarians want to trust this company, and we really hope that it's going to turn out well. But mostly it's about, you know, the short-term political and financial gain, and that, you know, that is a huge problem when it comes to radioactive waste issues in Hungary. I put this one sentence there: the lack of background radiation meter. It's just a short story that when I worked for an energy policy expert for a Hungarian NGO, we started to work together with investigative journalists, and we went down to see this facility and walked around the town, asked people what they know about the facility, the locals. It's only a 50-kilometer drive from Budapest, the capital of Hungary, so it's pretty close. And people who live there didn't know that it's radioactive waste disposal. They knew that it's a waste repository, but they weren't aware that it's for radioactive waste. So that was one of the issues that we have to face about, you know, lack of information and transparency. And the other one was that each and every town or village in Hungary has to have a background radiation meter that has a nuclear facility or radioactive waste disposal, or you know, these type of institutions. But this place didn't have a background radiation meter. So after we published our article, they finally installed one, which is a great, you know, great news. But that also raises a question that if you don't go there, then they just don't care about the problem. You know, that's a very, I think, a very important point to raise in our discussion. Like how can we, you know, be the authority, or like, you know, like replace authority in such a way. There's another radioactive waste disposal now for Paks nuclear power plants waste, only small and medium. And I just been there a few months ago to visit this visitor center. As you can see on the right, it's a very modern, very cool, very hip building. And on the left, you can see that it's in the beautiful nature, and you know, they live in balance with the nature and everything. What the funny thing was for me, that they actually highlight these issues. So when you attend a tour at this facility, they actually only talk about how the village is prospering because of this radioactive waste disposal, and they don't talk about the risks of radioactive waste issues. And I drove 2.5 hours to get to this place, and what I got from this tour was a YouTube video, like 4-minute YouTube video that they presented to us on how the village is doing very well. You could actually tell when you drove there that this county, Baranya County, where this place is a very poor county. But when you enter Bátorpáti, it's like a Bavarian town. It's beautiful. Like all the roads are perfect. Every house is, you know, renewed, and they have flowers everywhere. So you can actually tell that something is going on in this town, because, you know, it's too beautiful. Even it's, you know, it looks like a Disney town, to be honest. And what was funny for me too, that they emphasize that they are giving out tours for high school students. So that's, you know, raises another question, that if we want to educate students about radioactive waste issues, we should, you know, talk about the risks also, right? Not just about the shiny things and how the technology is thriving nowadays, but also we should highlight these issues about, you know, leakage and the health effects of radioactive waste issues. And, you know, we haven't even started talking about the spent fuel yet. So yeah, and at the end of this whole trip, I was laughing a little, because then a tour guide came with a huge bag of advertising materials, and I got this. This is a stress ball, because they told me that for my research I might be stressed, and then I'm gonna need this. So I actually use this, but you know, it's a very interesting thing that these are the advertising materials they gave out. And even though I asked about the risks, they didn't answer my questions. So that's an actual tour that they give out. And back to corruption and bribery issues. There is an ongoing research for the deep geological high-level waste storage in the region of Boda, which is a small town, southern Hungary, close to Paks nuclear power plant. And I put this photo on the slide. It's also, I'm sorry, I'm a storyteller, so stop me if I talk too much. But this is a really small example of bribery, but I wanted to highlight that these are the things that are happening now in Hungary. So 2 years ago, I organized a discussion at the University of Pécs for 150 people. I invited speakers pro and anti-nuclear fields, and it was a really good discussion. We really, you know, could actually argue about issues. But at the end of the Q&A, an old guy wanted to give a word, and he stand up. He said that he comes from Boda, and he wanted to highlight that the villagers there are very happy about this radioactive waste disposal, and they really want to have this disposal in their town. And then he gave out this wine to me, which says Boda Atom Cuvée, which means Boda Nuclear Cuvée. And then at the end, he revealed that, oh, by the way, I'm the mayor of Boda. And, you know, it was, again, a very obvious example of how politicians can be bribed, and how, you know, their short-term thinking is that if I give out a bottle of wine, there probably won't be more discussions on radioactive waste issues in the region. And what is interesting is that he is a member of the Western Mechek Social Information and Settlement Development Association, which is basically association with the mayors of the region in order to provide information to the locals about the deep geological high-level waste storage research. And instead of doing their actual job to, you know, organize forums and talk to locals and provide them studies and leaflets about how the research is going, what they do is that they spend most of their money on organizing village days once or twice a year, which is basically like, if you think about it, it's like giving circus and bread for the locals. So it's like inviting bands to play and then provide alcohol and food, and then that's what they spend their money on. And they also doing these guided opinion polls that I already mentioned every second year, and then they write a study about these polls and you know, discuss how the local public really wants to have this radioactive waste disposal in their towns. But instead of that, you know, they don't actually provide information for the public. And it's really hard to, even as a researcher, to get, you know, useful information from this association or the company. So how could we solve the current problem? I just put these things out for the discussion. I'm not sure if these are the, you know, correct answers. I just want to start the argument with these thoughts. So as I presented, this radioactive waste management issue is a highly politicized situation. And even though in Hungary, we're, you know, we are an extreme example, it is still the situation in every other country in the whole world. So when governments are thinking in short term, you know, the radioactive waste management issues won't be solved. So I mean, that's my suggestion that what we should do is to vote for governments, you know, who are not thinking in short term, or who can be actually asked about radioactive waste issues, or, you know, they have a clue what's going on or what's the problem. So that would be one of my suggestions. And the other one is, of course, strengthen civil society, or you know, including the civil society in the decision-making processes. I know it's different in Germany, but in Hungary, civil society isn't involved at all. So, and I know that this is the case in many other countries. Yeah, we already talked about it, that it's nuclear energy and radioactive waste issues are technological and political issues, but, you know, it's at the end, it's about us. So I think we should be included in all of these discussions in the research, and that's what I suggest. And of course, to have an independent media and balanced information in education, so, you know, future generations can decide whether they want to continue having more nuclear power plants, or this amount of radioactive waste that we have is already enough to deal with. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Esther. Thank you for bringing to the discussion the transparency issue of nuclear waste management in general, and in countries where corruption or power invades due to unstable political system, the issue becomes even more complicated and dangerous for the upcoming generations. Thank you once again for bringing the Hungarian case and your experience with the tour to the reactor. As I mentioned at the very beginning of the workshop, the role of intergenerational equity is an important component to ensure that the rights to sustainable developments are not denied for the upcoming generations to meet their needs. Today here with us, we have Laura, who will provide us an overview on tools and opportunities that young people can use to enhance their participation in the framework of nuclear waste management and other environmental issues as well. Please, Laura, the floor is yours.
Thanks a lot, Ergi, and hi everyone. Really happy to also be here, and thanks Jutta and Esther for the really interesting presentations you already gave. I just tried sharing my screen, but I think I shared the wrong window, but I'm going to try again. You should be seeing something on a presentation on, yeah, okay, great. Apologies for that. It's always a small adventure, I feel. Hopefully now it's also coming in on full screen. So as Ergi said, I will focus a little bit more on the kind of legal dimension that's at play here, looking at, well, what does intergenerational equity mean concretely? How is it anchored in international and EU environmental law? And what concrete opportunities for participation by youth and so on are there? And I hope that will kind of complement nicely what we've heard so far and bring the issues into kind of, okay, what can we make out of them and how can we be involved as a next step? So with that, I will start with looking a bit at, or talking a bit about what the principle of intergenerational equity means. And I'll start with a slightly more theoretical approach, because while this is of course a legal question, there's also a big philosophical, ethical, moral debate and so on behind this. And I think when we talk about this, it's important to define a bit and to discuss what we actually mean with it. So I've highlighted 3 elements here, starting with the first one on the temporal dimension and direction. When we talk about intergenerational equity, one first thing is, of course, to define, well, what do we mean with generations? Which kind of generations are we talking about? Are we talking about younger people alive today? Are we talking about generations in 1,000 years to come, and so on? And I really liked, Esther, when you said earlier, we are already the future generation, because I think that's totally true in many ways. But I think in looking at this question from a legal perspective, it's quite interesting to distinguish between younger generations alive today and future generations coming in the future that may not already be around at the moment. Then linked to that is the question, well, does it mean it's between generations alive today, which is then often called intra-generational equity, or between generations not alive today and those to come, which then is often referred to as intergenerational equity. And then another question, this temporal dimension question, is also, do we look at this legal question from a way of looking back in terms of what has happened in the past and how can we hold people in the past accountable for that? Or do we look at this from a future perspective? How can we make sure that what we're doing now doesn't undermine the interest of future generations? And when we talk about this issue, we mostly focus on this future element, but of course, there's also with heightened liability issues and so on, the backwards looking question could also be interesting. From a, again, more theoretical perspective, there's also a question of, well, what is this principle actually based in from not just legal, but also philosophical and an ethical perspective. And there's loads of different theories, so I won't go into those, but I think it's interesting to keep those in the back of our minds, because it also comes up again when we try to apply the principle in terms of how far it can go and what it can mean in practice. In addition, I'm just going to quickly check the chat, because sometimes my internet in this room isn't ideal. So if I start breaking out or something, please do tell me, and I will try to turn off my video, and maybe that will improve. Great, thanks, Eggy. So then some linked to, well, what is this principle and so on based on? There's also a few challenges that sometimes come in or that people raise in this context. So one challenge that is often made is that, well, people that are not alive today, so unborn people in principle or by definition cannot have rights because they're not alive, and therefore they can't claim those rights. There's also a whole other line of arguing, which is it gets quite complicated quickly, but is to say that, well, you don't know what people will be alive in the future, and whatever you do today influences who will be alive tomorrow. So therefore, we can't really do anything, or we can't really have obligations to those people, because that would inherently deny their existence in some way. So I'm not going to go into the detail, but I think if you're interested in this, there's definitely a lot to explore here. And then a third point that's sometimes raised in terms of challenges is also saying that, well, we don't really know what future generations will want and will need. But of course, it's easy to say, well, they probably don't want to live full of radiation and in ways where they can't really make free choices for their own and live a full life as they would like to do. So this was a bit more of a theoretical background, but now looking more concretely, is having these maybe philosophical challenges in mind, how intergenerational equity is actually integrated in international environmental law. And for that, we can go back to 1972, which is when the Stockholm Declaration, which is not a legally binding instrument, but a very influential political declaration on international environmental law, was adopted. And already in there, one of the core principles is that the natural resources of the earth must be safeguarded for the benefit of present and future generations, and making sure that they're planned and managed and so on as appropriate. 20 years later then, similarly, also a political declaration, the Rio Declaration, has also picked up this principle again with what is kind of now mostly known as the sustainable development angle, to say that the right to development must be fulfilled so as to equitably meet developmental and environmental needs of present and future generations. And we also see the principle integrated as one of the core elements of, or the core objectives and principles of the climate change framework. So in the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, the rationale also for protecting the climate system is to protect the benefit, is to protect the system for the benefit of present and future generations. However, in all these integrations of the principle, it remains rather vague and not really clear what it requires in practice. And of course, this is the more general environmental law context. However, through this principle being applied in courts, it is becoming slightly more clearer. However, maybe not as much as we would like to. So I've put down a few examples here. Starting with the International Court of Justice, which has had a limited role in further defining what this principle actually means, but has looked at intergenerational equity as one element to consider in the environmental context. And interestingly, in a few nuclear cases, well, they were not on nuclear energy, but on nuclear weapons. Of course, there's the issue of radiation spans across those different fields. And in the first one, the nuclear test case already in the 70s, while the issue was raised by the applicant, it wasn't picked up in the decision itself. But I think nonetheless, it's remarkable to point out how this was, of course, already considered at the time and raised as an argument. In an advisory opinion then in the 90s, the court made very clear what the harmful potential of radiation is and how that impacts future generations, but in the end also didn't come to a clear opinion on what that meant for the prohibition or not of nuclear weapons. And again, intergenerational equity was picked up in a year later in another case, but also in quite vague terms and not really defining it further. The European Court of Human Rights hasn't looked specifically at this issue in detail, but there is a case of a group of youth from Portugal coming up there very soon, where the claimants have brought up this intergenerational equity perspective. So perhaps that will be a context where we will learn more about it being applied concretely. But the last example here is quite interesting, because in the German Constitutional Court climate case earlier this year, the court did look a bit more in detail what intergenerational equity would require. And I've put a few of the main points on here, because it's one of the few cases that does look in a bit more detail what the principle of intergenerational equity applied to the concrete issue of a climate case here would require. So the main principles that they adopted was to say, and which was a kind of new way to look at the German basic law and fundamental rights in Germany, was to say that in some conditions, the constitution, the basic law, imposes an obligation to safeguard fundamental freedoms over time and to spread opportunities associated with freedom proportionately across generations. So it adopted through that what people then called an intertemporal interpretation of fundamental freedoms. So saying that fundamental freedoms must not just be protected today, but we must also make sure that we protect fundamental freedoms tomorrow, the day after, and so on. And then applied that in more details to the climate case and whether or not the climate law, how it was at the time was sufficient to protect those fundamental freedoms of younger generations. But what's interesting, and this brings me back into kind of the theoretical framework that I tried to introduce a bit at the beginning, is that the court did draw a distinction between what we can call intra and intergenerational equity. So intragenerational equity, meaning equity between young people alive today and older generations. So focusing on those that are already around now. For intragenerational equity, the court made clear that there is a claimable right for younger generations to make sure that their fundamental freedoms in the future aren't disproportionately interfered with. Whereas for generations that are not alive yet, so future generations, and therefore with intergenerational equity, there would not be a direct claimable right, but the state would have an objective duty to take protective measures. And while that might sound like a theoretical distinction, in practice, it has different consequences in terms of the threshold to which you can hold the state accountable and the kind of ways to check whether what the government is doing is reasonable or not. So it has real practical consequences in terms of the standard that you can the type of tests that a law must uphold in order to comply with those rights or obligations. Okay, so having looked a bit at what intergenerational equity means or can mean and where it comes up, it becomes, I think, or hopefully I've also tried to illustrate, or hopefully becomes clear that a lot of the content of how it can apply in practice is still to be defined. And of course, that also applies to the nuclear context. And therefore, I've now put some things together on what the regulatory framework for nuclear waste is at the moment, to also see how future generation equity and so on comes up there. So there's kind of, as very often, or as always, there's three levels. So there's the international level, the EU level, and then the national law. At international level, there's the Joint Convention on the Safety of Spent Fuel Management and on the Safety of Radioactive Waste Management, that was adopted or was agreed in 1997 and then entered into force a few years later in 2001. There's 87 state parties to the convention, and it establishes a sort of fundamental safety principle and a peer review process. And because it's quite general, there's also a handbook that tries to outline a bit more in detail of what some of the elements require and to provide some practical guidance, but of course the handbook is not binding. Then at EU level, there's a directive from 2011 also on what is called the responsible and safe management of spent fuels and radioactive waste. And it sets out requirements for member states to have a clear national policy for waste management, to have some general principles for the national policies that they must take into account in them, and sets out close monitoring requirements of those national programs for the construction and management of repositories. And of course, this is then supplemented by national legislation on implementing this and specific national rules. And I won't be able to go into details on this. But I did think it would be interesting to look a bit closer into how intergenerational equity and future generations are taken into account in the international and EU level. So at international level in the convention, this element of future generations is strongly integrated in it, because the Article 1, which sets out the objective of the conventions, there was 3, and one of them makes it clear that the objective is to ensure that there are effective defences against potential hazards now and in the future, so that present generations and future generations can meet their needs and aspirations, essentially. So there is a strong link in the international legal framework to making sure that nuclear waste management doesn't compromise the ability of future generations to meet their needs and aspirations. Of course, that is very, very vague, and what that actually means is then a whole other question, but I think nonetheless it provides a hook to make sure that it is in there and makes it clear that that is, of course, a key dimension. I'll come back to public participation, because that's, I think, then a point to make it more practicable, but I just already wanted to point out that there's no public participation requirement as such in the convention. There's a mere duty to ensure that the public is informed, so that's also a bit vague. At EU level then, it's similarly the case that for the subject matter and the objective, the directive refers to future generations, so saying that this directive establishes a framework to ensure responsible and safe management of spent fuel and radioactive waste to avoid imposing undue burdens on future generations. Interesting, of course, what undue burdens and so on means, then again, not further defined. But also in a little bit more detail, or kind of maybe even just in fluffier words in the recitals, there's also reference to making sure that says that member states have an ethical obligation to avoid this undue burden, and that by implementing this directive, member states will have to demonstrate how they've taken reasonable steps to ensure meeting that objective. And the directive does set out requirements for the transparency of information on nuclear waste management and also public participation requirements, but mostly refers to other legislation in place, so it doesn't set out its separate own mechanism. Okay, public participation and so on leads me quite nicely, and I'm trying to not make this too long because I'm aware of the timing, and I see Ergi nodding. So the big international convention on everything to do with environmental democracy rights, so access to information, public participation, and also access to justice, is the Aarhus Convention, which in its objective itself makes it very clear that the tools of the convention are there to protect the rights of the present and future generation to live in an environment adequate to his or her health and well-being. So there's also a clear future generations element in the kind of objective of the directive, the convention, the Aarhus Convention. There's 3 main elements, you see them here, but maybe you're already aware of them. We'll focus a bit on public participation, although of course, as we also heard from the presentation from Esther, there's a big need also to ensure proper access to information in this nuclear context, because it seems that there's often a lack of transparency. So the Aarhus Convention Article 6 sets out the public participation requirements, and it's clear that nuclear waste management and storage are explicitly included as part of those activities that require public participation, and it details a bit as to what that means. And then similarly at EU level, we have a directive that's called the Environmental Impact Assessment Directive from 2011 that also sets out requirements for public participation and also explicitly includes nuclear waste management and storage. I won't go too much into the details that I left other on the slides, but I think it's interesting to keep in mind or to look a bit at the kind of public affected and who is entitled to effective participation. I think the definition of public concern is definitely broad enough to encompass younger generations having an interest and so on, and also NGOs. But nonetheless, there's no explicit reference to future generations in the EIA directive. And also the elements that are to be assessed, or the effects on that are to be assessed of environmental projects, are very much focused on elements happening now rather than having a kind of cross-temporal perspective. But I'm going to wrap it up because I don't want to take too much time, but just to briefly sum up, the content and how exactly intergenerational equity can be applied and what it means in practice remains very vague. And that's particularly difficult for future generations that are quite far away. So there is a big need to further define what that means, and especially in the nuclear context, where nuclear waste legislation makes a reference to it but doesn't define it further. And public participation requirements and opportunities may provide some space to further do that, to allow for also meaningful engagement of youth, ideally, and to make sure that younger voices are heard, given that we are the ones who will have to put up with this longer than some others who are around, and that these can also provide opportunities to further define and specify what intergenerational equity concretely requires in the nuclear waste context. I'll stop here, but I'm looking forward to discussing with you and to hearing some questions perhaps as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Laura, for emphasizing and sharing the main principles of intergenerational equity and the opportunities of financing youth participation in the nuclear context and other environmental issues. I will invite the participants for further information on ARUS Convention. OIE has prepared a handbook that guides young people how to put the convention in practice. Following the discussion, while we have been collecting the registrations for the workshop, we have received different questions addressed to our speakers, touching upon different sub-issues of nuclear waste management. The main question that I have choose from the list of questions that we have received is addressed to three of you, and I will kindly ask you to answer shortly in 1 minute per speaker. How young people could elevate their voice and enhance their participation in the frame of the issue of nuclear waste management. And do you have any message addressed to young people for this? Jutta?
I think try to get your voice heard, try to approach politicians, try also to approach, let's call it intellectuals. So try to put up a public debate on this issue, because I think in many countries that are using nuclear energy, this issue is not addressed properly because the waste is stored somewhere, no one sees it, no one is talking about it. So I think the main issue is actually really to bring forward the debate on this. And I think it's also, it might be a good idea to, well, sort of make a collection of examples how things are being dealt with in other countries. For example, it took a very, very long time for us in Germany to come to a solution which I would regard as, let's call it sensible, because we have this stuff and we have to store it somehow, and it's no use pretending that we don't have to. But just in order to be able to foster the debate, you need examples on how it's being done in other countries. And in Germany, we now have this participatory process, which I think is very, very good, where people could could sign up for taking place in the debate. They're getting sent a lot of documents. They get the possibility to talk to experts about which geological solution has which disadvantages and advantages, because there's no one size fits all, of course, and every single site has its pros and cons, and also to include the communities that will actually be dealing with this stuff is also a very important decision to be taken, because what we have seen in Germany with the Gorleben decision, this was, let's call it, not the best way to ensure a peaceful way to deal with it, because it was done above people's heads, and therefore this fostered really the resistance. And as said, we have to deal with this legacy, and it should be done in the best way. And I think talking to politicians, talking to intellectuals, talking also to scientists that are working on environmental issues, trying to build a network, that would be some advice that I could give.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Esther?
I already touched upon this a little in my presentation, and I'm not sure if I can add more to Juta's comments, but if I can highlight the last point I was talking about is the education part. So even if your physics teacher is talking about the positive sides of nuclear energy, you can just ask about the risk, or ask your teacher to invite an expert who can talk about the other side of nuclear energy and talk about the radioactive waste issues. So that should be, I think, one of the options, to deal with this.
Thank you, Esther. And Laura?
Yes, thank you. I mean, I also agree with what Jutta and Esther have mentioned, and maybe also on the information and knowledge point. I feel a bit like the nuclear issue has gotten a bit in the background, or at least for me, I would say, in my context, given that our generation has the climate crisis, the biodiversity crisis to deal with. But of course, it's a bit frustrating and depressing, but we of course can't forget that we also have this nuclear waste issue that we have to deal with. So I think talking more about it is also an important first step to what Jutta mentioned, with raising awareness and bringing it up and integrating it into the debate. I think also within youth, it's between us ourselves. And then I think the additional point is trying to make use of the tools and opportunities that are there. So Jutta, you mentioned that there's great public participation programs in Germany. That sounds great. So trying to get involved in those, I think making sure that young people are also present. Of course, practically speaking, that's often challenging in terms of time, commitment, etc. But trying to make sure that and maybe also trying to find opportunities, find some support also from others to enable youth participation in those spaces, whether that's very practical through funding or through speaking to experts to gain expertise and so on. I think that would be great. And then also with access to information, trying to make use of opportunities for access to information requests, transparency requirements that do exist that aren't always properly implemented, but knowing that there are ways to request this information and to also challenge it through the Aarhus Convention and through the compliance mechanism of the Aarhus Convention, which is actually quite strong. But that's maybe a whole other chapter, but making use of the tools out there while of course I'm acknowledging that it can be challenging and difficult, especially on top of all the other things that are already happening. Thanks.
Thank you, Laura, and thank you to Jutta Paulus, Esther, Matthias, and Laura Hilt for sharing your expertise and opinions with us. Young people indeed play a crucial role when it comes to policies or issues where the future is impacted. Therefore, it has to be even more respected and welcomed in decision-making tables or discussions. We appreciate your participations in the panel of discussion, and once again, thank you for spending your Friday morning with us.